So purchased goods or supply chain is a very huge impact on the overall emission strategy for companies.
ESG has exploded into compliance and business consciousness in 2021. Join Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, on the ESG Report and learn about sustainability risks, opportunities, and issues that business leaders and compliance professionals need to know about regarding ESG.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome back for another episode. Today, we're going to take up emissions reporting strategy. Why Scope 3 is the key to disclosure success. I'm joined by Devin O'Haron and Jared Connors. Gentlemen, first of all, welcome. And Devin, if I could start with you, could you tell us your current role at Ascent?
Sure. Great to be here. My current role at Ascent is as regulatory and sustainability expert, focusing on ESG and responsible sourcing. I'm very excited to be working on our new ESG module.
Jared?
Yeah, I work side by side with my friend Devin here on our ESG and responsible sourcing module. And our job as a part of the quote unquote expert team here at Ascent is to engage the market, to go out and learn from those organizations, makers of standards, frameworks, industry groups, where the market is headed. What are the obligations for companies in terms of regulatory reporting and market expectations for that reporting? So we're happy to talk quite a bit today about not only Ascent and what we're doing, but also where the market is headed on these topics.
Jared, if I could continue with you on Scope 3 emissions. I think this is the one scope that many people do not understand. So if I could ask you to start with what is a Scope 3 emission, and then why is it so critical for either a risk or perhaps an opportunity right now?
Just to frame what Scope 3 is, there's actually 3 scope levels within the emissions reporting strategy. There's Scope 1 is things that might be like your leased or owned vehicle fleets, for example, things you're doing around your facility. And Scope 2 is the purchased heat or electricity to your facility, maybe from your municipal power source. So things that are contributing to your local facility. And Scope 3 is all those variables outside your 4 walls. And the most important impact of Scope 3, because it is so broad, it even includes things like employee travel. The most important aspect of Scope 3 is purchased goods. And so that has a really big impact on organizations that may not necessarily take in raw materials and directly manufacture from fabrication of those raw materials into a finished good. Say if I'm your average electronics company in 2022, chances are I don't directly manufacture my products. I may design those products and influence those products, but I get piece parts, raw materials, components through my supply chain, and I may even have the assembly of those products outsourced. You could say that about just about any industry in this day and age. So purchased goods or supply chain is a very huge impact on the overall emission strategy for companies. And that's why we're talking about this every single day with organizations from this side of the pond all the way through Europe and even APAC region.
So Devin, if I could perhaps turn to you for this next question, what impact does supply chain have on the overall emissions strategy of a company, or is it a different question?
Well, it definitely does have an impact on the overall strategy, and part of the increase in the level of awareness and need for reporting on Scope 3 emissions comes to the fact that it is such an impactful part of the overall picture in terms of emissions associated with manufacturing product. A recent Accenture study figured out that Scope 3 emissions are typically 11 times larger than an organization's Scope 1 and 2 emissions combined. So as mandatory climate disclosure legislations are being passed, the idea of carbon taxes, there's already carbon taxes out there today in certain forms. But as these progress more into the future, the overall emissions strategy, frankly, needs to start accounting for Scope 3 as much as possible.
Devin, if I could follow up, when I was first exposed to supply chain, I was rather stunned to find that that was my corporation's largest spend. And at that point, supply chain was still sort of consigned to a back room. Fortunately, we've evolved a little bit past that now, but is it really true that both the risk around the overall emission strategy, but perhaps the opportunity as well for many companies is going to be found in the supply chain, because simply the raw numbers of supply chain companies or vendors could be 10, maybe 100x what's on the sales side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you framed that as risks and opportunities, because when it comes to scope 3 emissions in particular, as we think about things like carbon taxes and accounting for carbon as a currency, almost as a cost of producing these products, on the one hand, there will be risk in terms of if you don't understand what exactly that applies to your organization. But on the other hand, sourcing decisions can then be made using carbon factoring into the equation. So it presents a big opportunity as well.
Jared, one of the, I'm not sure controversy is the right word, but at least one of the larger discussion points right now is around mandatory climate disclosures, how far they may go in the United States, where they are in Europe. But where do you see companies either being required to report on scope 3 or emissions from the supply chain, or maybe taking the step that it's in our interest to proactively do so?
Yeah, I'm going to channel my inner SEC on this one. Gary Gensler is going around and doing a lot of socializing of the Mandatory Climate Disclosures Act, and everyone wants to ask him about Scope 3. I've seen him speak on it twice now, and each time Scope 3 was in that word cloud that comes up on questions that the audience wants to talk to him about. That's the number one topic. And it's very clear through the Mandatory Climate Disclosures Act what will be required for companies. And it basically says that supply chain, or Scope 3, is only required if, one, you create a goal around it, or two, it's material to your overall emission strategy. And I love the wry smile that members of the SEC will have on their face when they talk about material to your overall emission strategy. Because if you, again, think of that example of electronics companies that don't necessarily manufacture their own product, or automotive companies who may assemble the vehicle, but all of those piece parts all come from supplier sources. All of that emissions that was produced in the creation, manipulation of raw materials and creation of those piece parts or sub-assemblies into that eventual product have a huge amount of impact on that footprint. And so companies that don't address scope 3, once Mandatory Climate Disclosures Act goes into effect here in the United States, for example, they're going to be held in the court of public opinion on, are those scope 3 or supply chain emissions relevant to their overall emission strategy? And the answer is that we're going to see a lot of companies going through the name and shame game, just like we saw with Conflict Minerals. I know that, Tom, you and I continuously do some of these podcasts, and I always go back to Conflict Minerals because I kind of feel like it's the grandfather of supply chain transparency regulations here in the United States. And that's a really great example of the way that companies will be held accountable in their overall disclosure strategy, and is what they include and how transparent are they. And if they ignore certain things because they go after the low-hanging fruit to say, I've flipped over my power bill for my own facility here in Arizona, and I've looked at what my CO2 equivalents are based on my kilowatt hours consumed and my power type, but I've ignored the broad and vast supply chain of all those incoming goods that I purchased to then assemble or sell my product into market.
Jared, if I could follow up on that, we have talked in other podcasts, as you correctly referenced, Conflict Minerals, supply chain, how perhaps companies need to dive further down their supply chain into not simply their direct contractors, but levels 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it may be. Do you see the same sort of rigor as either needed or even required in scope 3 emissions reporting?
Yeah, I really do. And that's going to happen at each level. So let's say, for example, I'm standing next to a fire. My need to create transparency with my disclosures as an organization. And I want to put that fire out, that doubt that I have transparency and accountability in my organization. I can fill up some of the water in that bucket to throw on that fire with my own emission strategy, but I need to pass that bucket back upstream to my left to make sure that the supply chain is providing me data. And my supplier, my tier 1 suppliers, are going to be able to provide me their overall emission strategy, because when I go to them for my scope 3, what I'm really asking is my supplier's scope 1 through 3. And so when I may start with their scope 1 and 2, things that are within the direct purview of those suppliers, ultimately I want to get their total emissions footprint. And that includes what they're collecting from their suppliers upstream, or maybe their purchased goods or services as it's stated in scope level 3 emissions. And so it's a really big part of the overall strategy, is that we talk about data collection at each level in the supply chain and how we may interact with our tier 1 suppliers, but the disclosure that we get from them, we need to make sure that they have policies, management procedures, and programs around also creating transparency with their upstream. So going back to the Mandatory Climate Disclosures Act for a second, Tom, that's obviously going to directly impact a finite number of companies, publicly traded companies here in the United States. However, as we see with any one of these regulations, they have an element of pass down accountability, as the phrase was coined so many years ago. I actually try to think of it as pass up accountability because we're thinking about upstream, our supply chain upstream of us and what we need to collect from those organizations in order to meet the expectations of these regulatory pressures or these market disclosure requirements to say, this is what I'm doing to create and promote transparency, not only in my operations, my four walls, but upstream of me as well.
Devin, if I could turn to you, we've had a robust discussion around emissions data. Do you see Scope 3 as limited to emissions data, or are there other environmental factors at play that companies need to think about and or perhaps report as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the conversation today is dominated by carbon, the legislations that are being talked about and things like that. But that's not to say that that's the only other material aspect or cost of producing goods, right? There's other environmental factors at play, things like waste management, recycled content in products, water usage, all of these additional costs that have not been traditionally quantified and accounted for when we're thinking about the final product. These all contribute to the product lifecycle and design of the product. And really, when we're talking about Scope 3 in a broader context of just carbon, it's about broadening the measure of impact to bring us closer to understanding and identifying the true full cost of how we provision ourselves today.
I have one additional question that I'll pitch to either one of you guys. I've tried to emphasize I see both risks, but also opportunities here. And by the very act of having to look down your supply chain, we saw in the conflict minerals that it provided greater information to companies to allow them to make supply chains decisions. Certainly after the pandemic, supply chains became much more on the forefront of companies' minds in terms of resiliency of their supply chain, once again, giving them more information. Is there the opportunity here, because you may have to look down the chain for emissions and other environmental factors, that you can actually get a business positive or evidence that you can implement in your corporate strategies going forward? In other words, does the greater information that you may have to obtain, could it really be helpful in other areas? And however you guys want to answer that one.
Yeah, I'd love to take a stab at this one. One of my favorite phrases is you can't manage what you don't measure. So this idea of diving into these details, and that's why ESG as a topic and how it's kind of gained such relevancy and traction in the market. It's providing that kind of common language and identifying these common topics to focus on in terms of getting that information. So that's what we're trying to do here at Ascent, is help everybody dial into their supply chain, raise the level of awareness on these different topics, and use that information not only to mitigate risk. Obviously we have a strong compliance basis for what we do, but it is also that opportunity. So I absolutely think that that's the case.
Well, gentlemen, and unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode, where we take up understanding risks to your responsible mineral program. Before we leave, Devin, if I can continue with you, if our listeners wanted any more information on any of the topics we've touched on in this podcast, where can they go?
Yeah, you can reach out to us, start a conversation with us, either by going to our website, ascent.com, or finding me and Jared on LinkedIn.
And I know both of these gents, and they love to talk about this stuff. So if you want a conversation, I would suggest you connect with them. Guys, thanks so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.